if you liked Bach, like this was horrible. Music was dead because people were wanting to dance to these new, very simple, early symphonies.
How are you, Thomas?
I'm good. It's a busy time of year.
Yeah.
With the semester about to start, but I'm hanging in there. How are y'all doing?
Good. What classes are you teaching?
I have one music theory lab that I'm teaching.
Okay.
And that was fun to do. I got a small but really advanced group of students who all have like some theory knowledge before they came to Brandeis.
Okay.
And they've challenged me as well to teach, because it's the first time I had the chance to do that. Mostly they'd had PhD students, second and third year PhD students doing that, and they had me as a lowly little master's student.
Nice.
Teaching that. But yeah, that's been a real highlight of Zoom school so far, is being able to teach and not just sit there and listen.
Yeah. Although I imagine you must listen to music all the time, huh?
I think I'm a little bit different than a lot of other people in the classical music world, in that I don't make a habit of sort of listening passively.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people, I mean, whether or not you're sort of in music, I know a lot of people who will simply listen to music all the time. Like they will do homework and listen, they will cook and listen. Like I can't do something else and listen to something. Like it'll either go way over my head, or I'll just like zone out and I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to chop this onion, but I'm like lost in paying attention to something else.
Now, is that because you're always listening for patterns and the way the theme is being expressed in a different measure? Like what does it mean when you're working as you're listening to the music?
I want to be fully present for the music that I'm listening to. And I've always sort of been like that, even before I knew that I wanted to pursue this as my field. And
I mean, is it an emotional connection you're looking for? Are you a scientist exploring the lines of the universe through the music? Like what are you thinking about?
I try to do a little bit of both of that, actually. And that's something I also like to try to explore my own pieces, is that I appreciate the emotional connection that music can provide. And you've got this great ability to express emotion directly to someone else in a way that goes beyond words. And that's like something that I think everyone who is a human knows this about music, and to some extent, is that there is a certain power to it. But I also, from a technical perspective, I want to know what the composer's doing. I want to know, okay, what's the orchestration here? I'm listening for the form, the phrases, like, oh, why was this modulation here? What makes this effective? Or if there's a certain moment that I like, I want to know, like, why is this effective? If it's not, how can I learn from that? And all in service of what sort of emotional affectation it gives to me, which is something that I can then learn and pass on if I want to express the same emotion down the line.
I have a question, Thomas. Do you have a memory of music from being very young? Like, what music do you remember making that connection between, how it takes all of you, or that first emotional connection? Was it classical music, or what kind of music was going on in your home growing up, or was there music?
There was some, not played, but on tapes or what have you. It was a very eclectic musical background that I had growing up. Neither of my parents are really musical to any extent, and they had a bunch of different cassette tapes, and one of them I remember was an album by the Tractors. Now, I'm not a huge fan of like country music. There's certain things I like about it, but it's not like a go-to genre for me. And I remember, just dancing uncontrollably in the middle of the living room, just to one of their songs. And they also had tapes of, there was a whole movement of like, oh, play Mozart for your kid. So they got a bunch of Mozart tapes, and I ended up not liking Mozart all that much because mostly because I found other pieces that were sort of in the wider world of classical music that I enjoyed a lot more.
Do you remember when you first heard Palestrina?
That would have been probably in high school when I first started studying counterpoint. And that would have been at a summer festival / intensive that was going on where I eventually did my undergrad. And the professor who taught that was the professor I ended up studying composition in undergrad. And he was still is like a big fan of that style of strict 16th century counterpoint, not Palestrina specifically. We did study up more Josquin de Pré.
That's Pope Julius. That's Michelangelo. That's a real change in the way we're thinking about music at that period of time. Yeah, it sort of sets the stage for a lot that's going to come later. What's significant about that time, that place? Because you're always doing, the thing that strikes me about you is you're a scholar of more than just the music. You look into their lives. Could you give us a little bit of what that period was like?
Sure. Yeah, I consider myself more interested like in the 20th century, I think, which is sort of the opposite end of it because of all the political intrigue that goes on. The fact we have like more direct sources and links to that. So there's a lot more comprehensive scholarship on that sort of stuff.
Although it seems to me you've covered a lot of things in there to be only interested in the 20th century.
No, well, I think if I had to focus on just one thing, that would probably, like, if I were a musicologist, that's probably I would say something from that. But what I was going to draw a parallel in that there's a connection between the political intrigue of the 20th century and the political intrigue of any era, and really the politics of music is what's so fascinating, because you listen to some pieces now and they seem relatively innocuous or beautiful, or they seem very serene, and then you realize that there were big fights going on, especially towards the end of the Renaissance, towards the beginning of the Baroque, about what the rules of music were and whether or not you could essentially break them.
To get there, though, it seems that Bach makes the rules. And, is there something, Bach to Mozart to Beethoven, a little bit of Haydn in there, makes the rules, perfects the form. And then Rachmaninoff breaks the rules, or somebody like that breaks rules. What's that arc that brings those things? Tell me, for our viewers, take me through what it means to be, this arc, because most people just hear these names and they don't realize that there's something going on that goes between them.
And I'm going to add one more question to that big question. It's like,
we're putting the big questions on you, Thomas.
You're going to have to solve all this stuff for us. Like, first of all, who's making the rules? Like, whose rules are they? And like, who gets to say these are the rules? And like, I just give us a little. I'm not involved in this in the way that you are, obviously, and so just some context, because what you have to say is so important, we think, and so just give us a little setup.
Yeah, well, there are many ways in which you can approach like the broadest history of these different styles, and one that intrigues me specifically is looking at it through a very scientific lens, which is the exception of higher and higher overtones as consonances. Now, what does this mean for people who are not in the know? It's like, well, if you have a certain sound, say like a pure tone, that's produced by any instrument, what you're actually hearing are overtones of that note, which it would be at certain ratios up. So the ratios become more complicated and the pitches become different, but you can analyze any pitch through this like a spectral analysis, and you can find all sorts of cool ways in which one sound differs from another, and like the way these are emphasized or de-emphasized is a lot. It's not in the entire reason as to why different instruments sound different, but it contributes a lot to that. So going back to for instance, Gregorian chant, like this was not accompanied. And then you slowly started to get more accompaniment with early accompanying, which was more like you were just doubling that a line or a chant at a certain interval. So if I'm singing here, someone else might be singing up here, which would be a very pure and open interval, such as a fourth or a fifth in our modern terminology. And this is like the first overtone up. Now, by the time you get to the late medieval era, moving into the Renaissance era, you're starting to use more chords that you might hear nowadays, major chords specifically, because those arise out of the harmonic series. Now, they weren't using them in the sense that we use them today, but they were starting to accept, if you have a note here, and then you're singing one, and I can't harmonize with myself, but it's a third, and this is like, people think of that as a consonance today. In the early medieval era, that was considered a dissonance. Like you couldn't have that because it was impure, and this was, a lot of it had to do with the way the Roman Catholic Church thought of music. So there's certain intervals that even in the Renaissance era were specifically banned. So the practice of doubling those notes eventually accepted more and more higher partials of this series, if you want to go by it that way, until there were perfect and imperfect consonances that composers could use. And then from there, they start to expand more with the amount of dissonance, or the notes that don't sound good together. But even then, there were certain ways in which you had to use them, because otherwise it sounded really out of the style. A lot of the rules that we think of, a lot of rules that music students are taught today, like no parallel fifths, no parallel octaves. A lot of that has to do with just, if you use them, it doesn't sound like it's in the style. But there are certainly exceptions you can find to those in any of these composers. And then to go to Jesse's question, I want to try to finish off one question before because otherwise I'll get really sidetracked. That's how my brain works. By the time you get to a composer like Bach, Bach is dealing with the history of this like very florid counterpoint, and like using all these melodies that work together against one another, and they harmonize really well with one another. But by the time Bach is, especially towards the end of his life, and he's writing some very complicated pieces, he's considered out of date because there was a reaction against this like super complex style of music.
But he's a giant. In his time, he's considered out of date, but this is genius music, and it's really setting the stage. What does he do that, then when you come to Haydn what does Haydn take from it, and then pass to the next guy?
There were, I think, a few more connecting dots in there than most names people know, which is actually kind of a failure of classical music education, sort of wider. People only know a certain number of names, but Bach dies in 1750, and then the real classical era starts of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven really starts around 1770-ish. There are some earlier pieces there, but there was a real transition of about 20 years, which some scholars call the Rococo era, which really wasn't really an era, which was just a transitional period between what Johann Sebastian Bach was doing and what Mozart was doing, for instance, and which are very, very different. So the transition period is full of composers that you don't really hear about anymore. Sammartini, for instance, like, who's heard of Sammartini's symphony? I have, because it was part of the music history curriculum at my undergrad. Other than that, there was no reason I would ever have to listen to something like that, other than it is that connecting tissue between the two. But there were a lot of composers who were really in the know admired Bach a great deal. He just wasn't considered a composer for the wider public. That was until Felix Mendelssohn in the 1820s. I'm bad on particular years because I'm very bad with numbers.
Yeah.
He, by modern standards, gave a really terrible performance of it. Like, it was not historically accurate, but it legitimized Bach in the eyes of the average concert goer. It was considered too intellectual up until that point, which explains why there was such a backlash against the style of Bach. But after the Baroque, like the reason the Rococo era is so interesting is because there are so many different composers, especially Bach's kids, who were writing in very different styles because they went all over the musical map in Europe. The ones who were male and who survived infancy, because he had 20 kids, but only about 6 composers, descendants of note.
Were they all the same woman?
No, he married twice.
Okay.
Most of the big grunt work was done by his second wife, Hannah Magdalena. But what was I with that? Oh, the backlash against it was pretty swift, but it meant that, you know, for instance, in France, there was something called like the galant style, which emphasized, you have basically melody and accompaniment. And that simplification, if you liked Bach, like, this was horrible. It was the death of music to a lot of people. People thought, you know, didn't have the term classical music then, but they thought that music was dead because people were wanting to dance to these new, very simple, you know, early symphonies by these various composers who were essentially working with a Baroque orchestra.
You just said something really important, that they didn't have classical music then, right? We didn't call it that, right? So how does it become classical music as opposed to other musics? It was just music.
Yeah, and that's something that you really don't see a split between what you would consider classical music today and popular music. I mean, there is you do see, like, there are folk musics which end up getting integrated into classical music in the Romantic era, but especially after World War II, really the politics of the day helped contribute to a real split between classical music and popular music. People started to see popular music as something that could be enjoyed at their leisure, or what didn't take as much brain power to understand. Whereas classical music went in an extremely heady direction. If you weren't doing film scores or part of the Eastern Bloc, you were writing some pieces that people did not get. People just did not understand them on a broad scale. So that exacerbated what was already sort of happening before then. In terms of the actual name, I would have to go back to where the name classical music comes from. A lot of the names of different isms and periods of music follow along periods of art. Usually music trails artistic trends by about a generation or so. So the classical style of painting was already very much in vogue, and the Baroque era was still going on. Then the classical era of music starts, and the Romantic era of painting has already started. Same thing with, say, Impressionism or even Symbolism, which was a poetic movement a little bit later. There's always a little bit of a lag between music adopting a certain trend or a certain name. But it is what you also said speaks to another issue, which is that classical music, big C classical music, essentially refers to the style of music that exists between 1750, which is the death of Bach. We take the end of the Baroque era by the death of Bach, which happens to be a kind of a nice even number, 1750, to roughly 1825, 1827, somewhere in there. Usually people date the end of it to either Beethoven's death or one of his symphonies.
Where is Beethoven in all of this? In your,
he's usually moving from apartment to apartment in Vienna.
But what makes those Bach and then Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, what's the genius of those composers? What is the thing that makes them so magical and enduring for so long? I mean, Bach was a religious character, he believed in the church. They're all different what they believed in, but that music is so enduring. Is there some magical quality that exists within those? I hear that music and it's like, there's something special going on.
I guess I tend to think of music in a little bit more of a concrete way and try not to be as carried away by poeticisms necessarily. I think that's just because I want to figure out what's going on. And to me, what makes Bach's music so great is that he does have this incredible command of melody and putting melodies together in ways that work against one another in counterpoint. To me, that's, if you don't understand like that as the heart of what he did, the religiosity that he infused into his music is going to fall by the wayside.
What does counterpoint mean for people who don't know?
Broadly speaking, the art of two melodies or two or more melodies going against one another at the same time. And there are certain genres which use it more than others. For instance, fugues. Even in Bach's time, fugues were considered very old-fashioned, but he wrote a lot of fugues that are, you can analyze them. Like, I'm not going to go into fugal analysis in this podcast.
How do you define a fugue?
It's a very specific staggered entrance of melodic voices which are going to imitate one another. So if you have one, usually starts with a single line, a single melody, and then you'll hear that trail off, and then that same thing, sometimes slightly changed, is going to come in a different key, slightly a related key, further up or further down. So you hear the same thing being introduced over and over.
Give us a name of one of those, because maybe what we'll do is put it actually in the podcast, the opening of something. So is there one that really defines a fugue? So, like we could add that in as you're talking, just so we can really actually give the audience this taste of what that is.
Well, there's plenty. I mean, really any fugue from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, you really can't go wrong with that. A more fun one might be Glenn Gould, the eccentric Canadian pianist, once wrote, "So You Want to Write a Fugue?" And there's a vocal version of that that's kind of funny.
How do you define a chorale?
A chorale is much more of a texture than it is. It's treated as much more of a texture than it is an actual form. I mean, chorale was that's the way that the German speakers understood hymns, as being, they were chorales. Mm-hmm. And the use of kind of block harmony textures, often, scored often for organ or brass or something that has a certain regalness about it. It's more of a texture nowadays. People will talk about a chorale texture versus more of an imitative or fugal texture as well. But even within Bach's chorales, like, he is using counterpoint. He's just not, they're just not as independent. But Bach was always keen on making sure that it wasn't just the soprano who had a great melody. I mean, if you were singing the alto, the tenor, the bass line, you're always going to be singing something that's interesting. And all those melodies could have been the top melody. And that's part of the genius of his counterpoint specifically versus the counterpoint of one of his contemporaries or successors.
He played with the pedals in the church. Did that change his way of thinking about composition in your mind?
I don't think so. I mean, I've played the organ, but I don't consider myself an organist. I'm sort of an emergency organist.
Yeah.
That's a different story. I would say that it wouldn't have affected him any more than it would have affected any other Baroque composer, simply because there were so many Baroque composers who were also organists.
You mentioned Glenn Gould. What was the genius that he, especially early in his career, what was the genius that he contributed, to the Goldberg variations and all that?
Gould is a really interesting character. For those who are not as aware of his eccentricities, he used to bundle up in like 5 layers of clothing, even if it was 90 degrees outside, bring in this tiny rickety old chair, and he would sit down at the piano, and he'd be really close up. His eyes were almost at the keyboard, and he would hum incessantly whatever melody he was playing, and he loved Bach. But he was also a great writer on music, and often he would present these writings in the form of scripted interviews with his friend Bruno, which is, a lot of them are on YouTube, and it's fascinating to see how his brain works, because even if you don't agree with his arguments and the way he presents things, they certainly make you think up good counter arguments. But he had very specific ideas on interpretation and the singing qualities of different composers, which is why he would hum. He stopped performing because he wanted complete and total control over the artistic output that he put out into the world. Like, he wanted recordings. He thought recordings were very much the future of music, like the concerts would cease to exist. Now, I don't think he foresaw a global pandemic necessarily, but those are, in a way, he was true about how recordings have shaped the way the music is delivered. In terms of his interpretations, I think he did a very good job with a lot of the Bach that he plays. I can't say I have heard much else of his that has a lot of emotional quality to it. Like he likes to, in his recordings, like he's always bringing out the exactness and the different melodic lines that are going on, especially in a Bach fugue, which oddly does serve him well when he's playing some more contemporary pieces, like a very pointillistic Webern score. He has a tendency to bring out, I think, somewhat more musicality than the score might initially make it seem like there is in a piece like that.
I have a question. What about someone like Aaron Copland?
Copland is quite an interesting case because I think Copland is known for writing very American pieces. Like people know of him as, writing Fanfare for the Common Man, which he then put into his Third Symphony, the suite from Billy the Kid or Rodeo, all these different pieces which have been used extensively, but in like beef commercials, for instance, stuff that makes it sound like you're on the open prairie in the heartland of America. But there was a lot to Copland that doesn't seem, at least on the surface level, to be typically American. He had an immigrant background. He was born, I believe, in 1900 in Brooklyn. And he grew up to have some communist sympathies, actually. He later had to rescind those, at least to a certain extent, when the House Un-American Activities Committee was coming after people. But he was also gay. And he felt, because of all these things, he felt like he was distanced from the sort of idealized America that people often associated his music with, which is a great irony. He's someone who pursued the music that he wanted to write, and he was one of the few composers of that era who was writing music that still was very much, in keys or sounded harmonious. He was not afraid of expressing himself in a much more traditional way, even though through his choices of instrumentation and orchestration and the way. Also, I read a dissertation on this one time. It's the way that he basically, the argument was the way he voiced his chords, the way he spaced out the notes in his chords, especially in brass instruments, gave that really open sound, which is characteristic of what people associate with the open range. But also, Copland, he, like a lot of composers, has been pigeonholed for a certain style or a few pieces that he wrote. But early and late in his career, he was writing some pieces that could really clear the room. I mean, Leonard Bernstein was known for playing some of Copland's piano variations, which is a piece from the Depression era. And he said that most times he would play that, he would literally clear the room, like people didn't want to listen to it. And then later on in his life, towards the end of his career, he lived much longer than his career. His career ended in, I think, roughly the 70s. He kind of petered out because he just didn't have anything in it, and eventually he had some degenerative brain issues towards the end of his life. But towards the end of, like, his last late Copland, as often people don't recognize it as much because it sounds dissonant. It sounds like there's still elements of the orchestration there, but he's adopting techniques of composers that really were doing the opposite of what he was doing. Trying to use all 12 notes of the chromatic scale evenly, for instance. And it's interesting to hear how he was able to square that circle and still make his pieces sound like Copland, even if they're not going to get a lot of airplay on the radio.
How do we know if it's a reflection of the mood, like his solace, his sadness, his despair? What, I mean, music is of the times. People are composing from what is their emotional experience or their lived experience, right? So, what's going to come out of the pandemic, for example? Is it going to be the great renaissance of music, or what? how do you think about tonality throughout the ages? But Jess is he probably wants to ask you a question. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Finish what you were saying.
Yeah, no, I'm so fascinated with music coming from a time, like it's not, you can't separate it out. So you're listening for the detail of it, but how much of it is connected to the world that we live in, what the expression of it?
Yeah, I've always seen the study of music history as the study of cultural history. Like if you listen to a piece from a certain time, you're getting a better sense of how people in that time lived and felt than simply reading something dry in a textbook about, who was elected when and what policies were instituted when and who went to war and yada, 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 which is a boring view of history that I think a lot of people who don't like history think history is like that. Which is why a lot of times, if I'm even if I'm, covering a particular composer ostensibly, there's going to be so much more. There are political and cultural ramifications that you can really do a deep dive into and understand, like, what was this music for? Like, why does this instrument exist? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? And you can pull in these threads and you'll discover not the answer to not just the answer to your question of or a question anyone has on the why of one specific thing, but you'll get a better sense of like, oh, this is how people in this era, in this part of the world, thought of this type of music, or this is how important music was to, for instance, controlling people. This is the story of most totalitarian regimes, is the story of suppressing even completely instrumental music, and music that you don't think would foment insurrection, but yet a lot of times that really heavy-handed dictators would be very much afraid of that.
Mussorgsky. So, this is a strange story, which I did not realize. So would you tell us that story a little bit, and don't leave anything out?
Oh, it's been almost half a year since I did my Mussorgsky video. Mussorgsky, most famously known for Night on Bald Mountain, or excerpts from his pictures in exhibition. Mostly it's orchestrated by Maurice Ravel and not the man himself, because it was originally for piano. He was part of a broader cultural movement in Russia known as, well, not cultural. He was a part of a group of composers who fancied themselves part of a broader cultural movement, which was the big question in Russia at the time. This was like the middle of the 1800s. Was Russia going to be East or West? Like, was it going to be more Europeanized, or was it going to be entirely self-sufficient? And Mussorgsky was part of a group of composers known as the Mighty Handful, or less fun, the Five, who believed quite strongly towards the beginning, and they didn't split apart because they went their own separate ways. A lot of big personalities in that group. They believed that Russia should be kept free from European influences. So what this meant is that they were actually fighting against other musicians in Russia at the time who were trying to, for instance, found conservatories. They were trying to present European music and say, hey, hey, play some Beethoven. We should be more like Beethoven. And then Mussorgsky and his compatriots would be pushing against that. And they were trying to, without any formal training, or with barely any formal training with some of them, trying to create a school of Russian music. And the amazing part about that is that they pretty much succeeded, to the point that sort of the nationalistic sentiments that they imbued into their music, and the sort of rough around the edges feeling, really still does communicate to people, especially in the case of Mussorgsky, because he had probably the least work ethic of all of them. He was drunk most of the time. He had a lot of projects, especially operatic projects, that they had various irons in the fire, and they would inevitably be left incomplete, except for one opera, which he only completed because another member of that group, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, was for a time his roommate, and you could check out on him and make sure that he was writing his opera.
But I mean, he was really sort of a Dostoevsky sort of, he loved alcohol. He was getting drunk, like the reason he didn't produce this work was sort of predictable in a way.
Yeah, I mean, well, every like negative stereotype you have about Russians loving alcohol, he was probably it, which is unfortunate because it's a really sad story of someone who was that talented who was lost to alcoholism, and he died in his 40s.
Now this correctly. Last, night on Bald Mountain, will you describe that one? Because the way this becomes a piece is so interesting because, I mean, he wrote it, but did he? I mean, what are your thoughts about this?
He initially wrote Night on Bald Mountain as, I believe it was supposed to be sort of interstitial music for one of his incomplete operas. I don't remember which one necessarily because there were a good number of them. And he left this piece pretty much in tatters. If you were going to listen to his former roommate Rimsky-Korsakov, he left the piece in a really unperformable condition. And Rimsky took it upon himself to correct Mussorgsky's errors in orchestration. So one of the interesting things you can do with that piece is that, at least for a time on YouTube, there was a really rare recording of, I believe, an orchestra in the 1960s who performed the initial version, the uncorrected version of Night on Bald Mountain. And when you compare that to the version that we know more of, which is Rimsky-Korsakov's version, I mean, immediately there are a lot of question marks. I mean, the timpani are doing something really quite strange. The strings are not spaced out in a way that makes them most effective. But for my money, like there's a really rough around the edges quality to the original that it's frightening. Like it's legitimately scary. It sounds like you're part of that witch Sabbath. Whereas the Rimsky-Korsakov version, I mean, it's still basically the same piece. He touched up the orchestration. He moved around some of the sections. Some people like to claim that he was more of a co-composer in that. I like to give Mussorgsky a little bit more credit. But the version most people are familiar with is a version that's modified from the Rimsky-Korsakov, which was done by Stokowski for Fantasia.
What do you think of all this music? Like, what does it tell us about the past and memory? And when we hear Beethoven, is he speaking directly to us from a different time and place? When I listen to a jazz recording or a blues recording, I'm literally hearing that person. I'm hearing that place come through. When I listen to Beethoven, is it time travel?
I think I have two different takes on this depending on which side of my brain is going on at one time. So if it's the music history side of my brain, I'm more inclined to say, like, certainly there is an abstract message which is being encoded in a lot of Beethoven, not necessarily one piece or another, but for instance, middle period Beethoven from the third through fifth symphonies. Basically, you have this story of overcoming struggle, and there's a lot of ink that has been spilled about the parallels between how Beethoven's forms develop and what sonorities he uses, and him going deaf. And I do know that on a personal level, I had a friend who, in undergrad, who was born deaf in one ear, and she eventually got an implant so she can hear out of it now. But it is for that reason that she identifies very strongly with Beethoven and about the overcoming of struggle that she sees in a lot of his music. And so I'm more inclined to say that is a part of what Beethoven's legacy is, and part of the reason that we still listen to his music is that you listen to the Ninth Symphony and you realize he never heard a note of it. He just hear it all in his brain. Like that is, it's mind blowing that you could be able to do that. I mean, it is such a fantastically well constructed piece. However, the composer side of my brain says we play Beethoven too much. Like there's a lot of hero worship. There's a lot of museum culture when it comes to orchestras, especially. 2020, one of the running jokes in a lot of younger classical music circles was One of the good things about the canceling performances is that they didn't have to celebrate Beethoven's 250th birthday. And with apologies to all my Beethoven-loving friends and colleagues and mentors and professors over the years, I don't think the world needs another performance or another recording of a Beethoven symphony. Like there is no interpretive decision that you can make and put to disc or put out into the world that hasn't already been done before. Probably by a better orchestra, probably under the baton of a better conductor. And the reason that orchestras are so addicted to Beethoven, I think I'm not saying we should stop playing Beethoven whatsoever, but I do think there needs to be an understanding of why we're playing him so much, which has a lot to do with the current state of like where classical music is versus, Beethoven just happens to be the composer that I picked, but there's a certain upper echelon of famous named composers that pretty much everyone can name, and then after you get about 5 or 6 names, average person's knowledge list really drops off the board. When there are thousands of composers who have pieces worth listening to, why are we focusing on not just these few names, but just a few pieces of theirs? Like people hear Beethoven 3 and Beethoven 5 and 6 and 9, but who's ever heard Beethoven's 4th Symphony? Like average person is not going to be able to know what that is.
Yeah.
Average person knows what Beethoven's 5th is.
I would say though, I'm asking this question, but is there a reason that, there's probably many, you're right, thousands of people we don't know about, but what is it about that? And now I'm thinking in my head, I'm listening to the 9th Symphony in my head. I'm like not even listening to you anymore. And I'm like going through the whole thing.
That's fair.
No, I am listening to you, but you know what I mean? Like, why does it stay? And that's just a question maybe for another day, but those somehow the longevity, the classical, these things that then become great, they do stay with us for a reason. Shakespeare, we've talked about a lot of amazing things, and we've talked to people on these podcasts about what makes something survive. It's just a question.
Isn't that what you're exploring on your channel?
I mean, to an extent, like I want people to go into the listening of a certain composer, even if they know the piece, but I want to provide at least something to even the connoisseur, like, oh, I didn't know that. That gives me a fresh perspective on this. To speak more to Priscilla's question, which is, I mean, that really is part of the question, is that there's some people who think that, oh, these are great pieces, like, we need to keep listening to them. I'm not saying we need to get rid of them in the repertoire. The issue that I have with it is that there are really a limited number of performances, just from a practical scheduling perspective. And as, also a composer, like every time that, some dead Viennese dude gets a performance, that's one fewer that I can get, or one fewer that one of my friends can get.
Yeah.
Well said. And for those watching, Thomas has a show, it's called Classical Nerd, where it's incredible, where he's going to take us through so many different composers, and really want people to go and explore.
And questions, what is opera, what is Baroque style, all these different questions are explored there. It's quite wonderful. The channel really is quite amazing. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's really been a labor of love over these past, well, I started in 2016, so we're going
it feels like a labor of love.
And I'm sorry, we didn't even get to talk to you. I mean, you're a composer, obviously, in your own right. So maybe on another day, there's a lot to talk about with you. And it's so great to have that context. So we hope people go out, listen to some music, watch your show, and just do nothing else. I think you really struck me in the beginning where you said you don't want to be distracted. And I think so much about, we just are always doing a lot of different things, but just to take in the great piece of music and just see what happens.
Yeah. And I encourage people to explore, composers that they don't think that they've liked before, or, find always, when I'm listening to pieces, I just don't stick to what I know that I like. It's like, you have to go out and explore so much more than you think. I think that's especially true with classical music. And that's the main point that I try to make to people, is like, why is classical music relevant? It's like, well, what you think of classical music is like this little sliver, when there's a huge, vast swath. out there. And even if you don't like one little piece of it, you shouldn't discount all the rest of it. The problem is people just don't know that there's so much else in that world. But I do think that audiences and potential audiences are a lot more intelligent and a lot more willing to learn and willing to be educated on this. They just need a resource out there that can help them get into a world that can otherwise seem very daunting. Again, much like Shakespeare, people can know, Hamlet and Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'm a big Comedy of Errors fan, and big Comedy of Errors reference, no one's gonna get it. I'm like, but all the puns are so good. I mean, where is it? Oh yeah.
What's it say? I can't read. It's too small.
Complete Works, William Shakespeare.
Oh, nice.
All right.
Well, thank you very, very much, Thomas. And we look forward to speaking to you again.
Oh, anytime. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.